really support that idea. The Democrats, again, held on to some seats that year. And then in 1934, which of course was the beginning of the Great Depression. So it's very rare for a president's party to win seats in the midterm election. And there's a reason for that, right? It's a reaction to the presidency. The president's honeymoon is over. There's typically sort of a change. Typically, the president's party has won seats during the presidential election that maybe it probably normally wouldn't win because of coattails, et cetera. And so there's a normal rhythm in our politics that says the president's party is going to typically lose seats, and they're going to lose more seats when the president is not particularly popular. At the moment, President Trump's approval rating, depending on what poll you look at, the average is around about 40%, and the disapproval is about 56%. So he's not exactly sailing into the midterm here with the wind at his back. And so one would expect that Republicans would probably lose seats partly as a result simply of these national conditions that people are feeling at the moment. You might say, well, why? How could that happen? I mean, he just won election 2 years ago. You know, things just aren't going well, quite frankly, with respect to gasoline prices. The country's at war. And so regardless of what you think of President Trump, the conditions just aren't really good right now for Republicans. That's not to say they can't win. It's just to say that typically they would not win. Now, one of the things that's going to mitigate against their losses is going to be local conditions. And I'm going to get to that in a minute, but focusing on the national just a little bit more, one of the indicators that we sometimes look at is what's called a congressional generic ballot. And that is simply just saying to people, if the election were held tomorrow, would you vote for a Democrat or would you vote for a Republican? And right now, the Democrat edge is about 6 percentage points, and that typically, again, plays into the favor of the minority party, in this case, the Democrats. So the national conditions are kind of all, in this particular election, are all with the Democrats. There's one other really important consideration that we look at when we think of trends, and that is that when one party controls all of government, that is to say they have a presidency, they have a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate, which is what the Republicans have right now, the voters tend to correct. They tend to correct and put a check on that. And I'm reminded of a passage actually in Federalist Paper number 51, which is written by James Madison. He's got a little house here, not too far from here. You got to go visit it. It's pretty good. In which he said that a dependence upon the people is one of the first checks on government. And what he was referring to there are midterm elections. He was saying every 2 years the Congress is going to be, the voters are going to get a chance to vote, and they're going to make corrections as needed. And what we have seen repeatedly since 1994 is that when the party has control, majority control, as the Republicans do now, the voters tend to react by checking the power, okay? And so when you see, like, for example, in 1994, after Bill Clinton won a presidential election in 1992, the Democrats lost the House and they lost the Senate. In fact, in 1994, the Republicans had won a majority for the first time in 40 years. And that was all in reaction to a Democratic unified government. In 2006, President Bush had just, 2 years after President Bush had won re-election, the Republicans had unified party control, and once again, they lost the House and the Senate. They lost 37 seats in the House in the 2006 election. In 2010, excuse me, 2 years after President Obama had won a big victory and the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, they passed the health care bill, et cetera, the Democrats lost 63 seats in the House. So there's this reaction. Trump, 2018, excuse me. After Trump wins the presidential election in 2016, Republicans take control. 2 years later, the voters react again, 41 seats for the Democrats. One more time, Joe Biden, 2022, right? He wins election in 2020, Democrats win the majority in the House and Senate. 2 years later, Democrats lose 9 seats and they lose the majority. So if the pattern, again, political science look at patterns, if the pattern holds up, I got some water right here, thank you for bringing that. If the patterns hold up, there's a really good chance that Republicans will lose seats and probably lose the House of Representatives. The Senate is a little bit more challenging. We'll get to that. So you have these national conditions, but they're not the only things that matter, right? I mean, the reality is most of us vote on what's in front of us, the candidates that we see, not, a referendum on the president, let's say. But the number one factor that that drives these elections at the local level is what's called district partisanship. And that's a fancy term for basically saying, like, is the district leaning more in a Democratic direction or a Republican direction? And it turns out that the vast majority of seats in the House of Representatives today are safe seats. That is to say, are safely Democratic or safely Republican. There really is no election in those seats for the general. The really only action in those kinds of elections tends to be in the primary elections, where someone in the party is trying to take on an incumbent or trying to win an open seat. District partisanship dominates at the local level. That is not to say that there aren't seats that are competitive, because there are. There just aren't that many. I'm just looking at my notes here. At the moment, there are probably about 40, 45 seats out of 435 that are actually competitive in this country. Now in Virginia, of course, we have to put an asterisk on Virginia because we don't know exactly what districts we'll be voting in, or the candidates will be in those districts at the moment. But right now, according to prognostications by Charlie Cook and Larry Sabato, these are the best prognosticators in the country, you're really looking at about 18 seats that are toss-ups, and then another maybe 18 to 20 that are leaning one way or the other. Now, again, the districts are unsettled. I mean, Tennessee just changed its map like 2 days ago. And so in Virginia, we still don't know what the map is going to be. But under normal conditions, what you're dealing with here is essentially most of the districts in this country are pretty much hardwired to be either a Democratic or Republican district. That narrows the range of seats that one party can actually win in an election. So district partisanship is very important. The other thing that's important is whether or not it's an open seat or there's an incumbent running. Incumbent members of Congress, members who are running for re-election, tend to get reelected at pretty high rates, partly because they are a good fit already for the district, partly because they have public resources that allows them to advertise, partly because they're well known in their district, and so they typically win re-election. So the seats that are most vulnerable tend to be open seats. That is when someone has retired and the seat is up for grabs. And in those cases, the chances of beating a Republican have a lot to do with the quality of the challenger. That is to say, how good is the person running against the incumbent? And typically, we measure quality by determining whether or not they had any prior experience in winning office, whether they have any money to run, have access to money, or whether they have a certain celebrities that have brand name as a result of something else they've done in life. Athletes, astronauts, actors, right? So the 3 A's. So again, the quality challengers, getting back to a previous point I was making, the quality challengers are people who are going to act rationally. They're only going to get into a race when they think they can win it. And so the more competitive the district, that is to say, the closer the alignment is between Democrats and Republicans, the greater probability of seeing what we call a quality challenger, okay? And I'm going to show you an example of that from the VPAP in a moment. So taking a step back again, let's just think about how we think through these elections. You got these national forces that are driving things. Typically, these national forces are impacting turnout, voting turnout. I mean, there are two choices that voters need to make. Number one, do I want to vote at all? And number two, who do I vote for? And I think what happens sometimes, particularly in these situations, is that the majority party's enthusiasm is suppressed a little bit. So in this case, Republican enthusiasm is probably going to be a little bit more suppressed than normally. And the other side, the Democratic side, is going to be a little bit more enthusiastic. And so voter turnout makes a big difference in terms of these outcomes at the margin. So there's that broad kind of national set of conditions, and then we have to look at some local conditions, and that's where I want to kind of look a little bit more closely at Virginia. This is a website, vpap.org. Just by show of hands, how many people are familiar with this? Just curious. Quite a few. Okay, good number. This is a really good resource, kind of a nonpartisan organization. David Poole created it. He's now moved on, but they do wonderful work in terms of pulling together data, both in terms of campaigns and elections, and also in terms of the state assembly and how people vote on issues and issues that they patron and that sort of thing. Very user-friendly. And it was created from the idea that Virginia never, until about the 1980s, really never had a means of tracking campaign finance data. It essentially started as an organization that tracked campaign finance data. Virginia, for state-level elections, is a state that allows donors to give money to any candidate in any amount. There's no restrictions on the amount of money you can give a candidate. So after the talk is over, I'm going to announce my candidacy for the Congress, and I'm going to ask you for some money. And if you'd like to give me $1 million, you can. It's no problem. You can give me $1, you can give me $1 million, you can do whatever you want. Now, at the federal level, things are regulated a little bit more. But for state legislatures, for the state legislature, for governor, for attorney general, whatever, there's really no limit. And so what VPAP said was, we should probably be tracking this, because one of the virtues of a system like ours in Virginia is this idea that, okay, just about anybody can run. Excuse me, Delante's password is in need. Delante, we're going to need your password. I've managed to put the computer to sleep. It's not an easy thing to do. In any case, so VPAP was put together partly to track these campaign contributions and say, look, you can give as much money as you want, but the public ought to know who you're giving money to, all right? And thank you very much, Delante. And so that's what they started out to do, but then they built it out much more so from there. So we're going to take a look at elections, and we're going to look at elections for federal office, because that's what we're interested in today. And here's the House of Representatives. And here is the current map, that is to say the map of House seats, thank you, before the redistricting. So I look at this map, and as a sort of a political scientist, I say, this map sort of makes sense to me. I mean, it's pretty well balanced. There are some conditions that we typically put on congressional elections. We generally want them to be compact, reasonably compact, contiguous, that is to say the parts of the district should be connected in some way, shape, or form. And of course, equally balanced in terms of numbers, which is easy to do. The hard part is the rest of it, where to draw the lines. And this is the current map right now, and I believe we're in this district right here. Nope, we're in this district right here. We're in Rob Whitman's district. It's District 1. And this is a Republican-leaning district. I think Trump might have gotten about 55% of the vote, but we can validate that by looking at it a little more closely. The question is whether or not this district will survive, and that's going to depend on the Virginia Supreme Court. And here's the new district. Okay, and this was a district, I'm sure you all have heard all about this. This is the new district. And what you're seeing here, obviously, is a lot more blue than red. This proposed district takes the current balance of House seats, which is currently 6 Democrats and 5 Republicans, to potentially 10 Democrats and 1 Republican. I say potentially because these districts are carved up on the basis of the percentage of the two-party vote for governor. So if you kind of go over these a little bit, here you see what they're going to call the District 8, right, which is going to be to the east of us. And you can see there that for the 2025 gubernatorial election, Abigail Spanberger won 63% of the vote. That's what makes it a Democratic-leaning district. Winsome Sears only won 36.8% of the vote. So that is in terms of getting back to what we were talking about before, district partisanship. This is a very safe Democratic district, okay? And so it's the same thing as if you move down here, which is into the 4th district. This is Jennifer McClellan's district. These are very safe districts because they have a significant amount of Democrats in it. And if the Democrats show up at the same rate as they did and vote in the same way they did in the gubernatorial election for all of these districts, then the Democrats are going to win 10 seats, and the only Republican left is going to be Morgan Griffith over here in the fighting ninth, which is even bigger than it in geographic terms, much bigger than it is currently now. What's wrong with this map? Well, what's wrong with the map is that it's heavily partisan. It's designed essentially by the majority party to win seats. And as you all know, it was passed in a referendum recently. And the main argument that the Democrats were making, which is a fair argument because political parties are set up, designed essentially to win power, that's what they're designed to do, is to say, well, Trump started this in Texas, and so we need to kind of combat that. And so we're going to do this temporary fix. We're going to change the Constitution temporarily, and then we're going to go back to our bipartisan redistricting in the next redistricting. We'll see how that works. But the point is that the Democrats said this is a reaction to what's happening nationally. We need to get into the game. And so but to me, what's wrong with this district is that there are literally 4 districts that intersect with Fairfax County. And in no world would you want to see that. I mean, you typically would want to keep counties together as much as possible. But right up through here, you're starting to see a great kind of concentration. And in order to get these to be Democratic districts, what do? You see this tiny sliver up in Northern Virginia, and you see it spread way out, okay? Democrats tend to live in more compact areas, in urban areas. Republicans tend to live more in rural areas, okay? The old method of what this basically is doing, essentially, is what they call cracking the district. And so you have like this concentration of one party in a small part, like here up in Alexandria, Arlington, Fairfax, et cetera, and then it spreads out down into, all the way down to the Richmond and Roanoke lines. And that's how the Democrats are able to achieve this kind of, kind of 10-to-1 kind of balance, or imbalance, if you will. Again, we can talk more about that, but that is the biggest change that's happened in Virginia politics for the election, and it speaks directly to the theories of political scientists, right? Because what is it saying? It's saying district partisanship matters. Pick your voters, then the party wins seats. That's kind of how it works. And now I think what's happened, and this is not just in Virginia, this is all over the place, because of GPS and because of data that we have and the precision that you can literally draw, if you want, a district. In fact, there are districts that are drawn literally between someone's front yard and backyard, so that if you're living in the garage, you're in a different district than if you're living in the house. That's how specific that we can get with the data. So I think that's what the Democrats have done here, but the Republicans have obviously done it as well. They've done it in Texas. They're doing it now in Tennessee. And so we're caught up in this highly hyper-partisan kind of situation where we're actually drawing districts 5 years in, 6 years in. Typically, we want to at least go through a decennial, which is 10 years of redistricting, of changing the district, reapportioning the districts across the state before we redistrict. We're really truncating that to about 4 or 5 years. And of course, that creates a certain degree of instability, okay? So how has that impacted Virginia? Well, if we go back and look at these seats, we can actually look under general elections, and you can see what's actually happening here. So in the first district, which is this current district, won't be named as such after the redistricting, you can see there are a bunch of Democrats who have lined up to take on Rob Whitman. Why? Even if the districts do not change, this will be a competitive race. Let's say the court says the referendum doesn't hold, we're going back to the existing districts. This race will be competitive, and it will be competitive partly because the district partisanship definitely leans Republican, but in a year where the president is not very popular, right? And in a year when the Democrats are feeling like they can win, they're trying to reach for this seat because this seat is not there necessarily for the taking. But if you do have what we call a wave, which can happen, where there's just like a rising tide, some districts that are currently held by Republicans that are deemed to be reasonably safe will be lost. And they'll be lost in particular if the Democrats, in this case, put up a good challenge. Now, if you look at the list of these candidates right here on the left-hand side, the strongest candidate, at least in my opinion, would probably be Shannon Taylor. She's been elected to a previous office. She's raised a lot of money. She has the capability of running a good campaign. So if the Democrats can get around this candidate, they probably could put up a good fight against Whitman. Whitman has been, by any measure, a good incumbent politician in terms of connecting with his district, et cetera. But he's faced a lot of troubles, and there have been some protests against Rob Whitman. And so it is a race, I think, that would be competitive, even if there were no redistricting. And then, of course, you have this district down here, the congressional 2nd district, where Jen Kiggins is the incumbent. And here, the odds-on favorite is probably Elaine Luria, who was a member of Congress. So you're talking about a district that can go back and forth. It's one of those rare districts that can be won by either party. And obviously, that would be a competitive race, regardless of whether or not there was redistricting. Much more competitive even than the 1st district. I mean, in the 1st district, Whitman would be probably predicted to win, even though it might be competitive. And then you get into some of these others. This is Bobby Scott in the 7th Congressional 3rd and Jennifer McClellan, and they literally have no opponent. These are heavily, heavily Democratic districts. A good indicator that, and here we have the 6th district, where Ben Klein is the Republican incumbent. And these 3 candidates here, they are not high-quality challengers. And that's what we'd predict, right? We would predict that in a safe Republican seat, you wouldn't attract a really high-quality challenger because they would think, I don't have a chance of winning. I might get some votes, but the district partisanship is going to overwhelm me. This is the most interesting district of all. That's the 7th district, the current, I guess that would be north of here. And here, the incumbent is Eugene Vindman, who is literally a fundraising machine. He has raised a ton of money, again, for this race. He won a competitive race last time. This, by the way, is Abigail Spanberger's old district. And she's an interesting case study in itself because she was able to win an upset victory against Dave Bratt in a year where Democrats were favored. But look how many Democrats are in this race. I mean, they're all thinking Dorothy McAuliffe is the former governor's wife. Adele McClure is a delegate. Salim is a delegate. Guzman is a former delegate. Helmer's a delegate. I mean, we're talking about potentially high-quality challengers running in this race because they think they have a chance of winning, right? And they think with the redistricting, Vindman's going to wind up in a different seat, and so someone's going to win this race. On the Republican side, Tara Durant is a senator. So again, high-quality challenger. Where do you see? The evidence is leaning pretty clearly in the direction that if you are in a strong Democratic seat like McClellan or Scott, you're not going to get much opposition. If you're in a competitive seat, you're going to get a lot of candidates interested in the race. So that's just it in kind of a nutshell on what's happening in Virginia. Again, it all depends on what happens with the court's decision on this map as to how many seats the Democrats are going to gain. My guess is, again, I think they would probably pick up 1, possibly 2 seats anyway. But chances are, it's all going to depend on the outcome of this case. So we talked a lot about redistricting. You might have some questions on that. I'll just put a footnote on that for a moment. What else is going on? What issues are important? Well, again, nationally, I think the economy is very, very important. Inflation is a critical factor in congressional elections. The watchword that people are using is what's called affordability. But essentially what that means is prices are really high and I can't keep up. And so there's that factor that's really critical. And the other is that the country is essentially at war. Maybe yesterday we weren't, but today we are, or something's going on with that. But the reality is we're at war. And I do think that some of the president's policies have actually contributed to inflation. Just thinking at it from basic macroeconomic terms, it turns out that if you run up a deficit even higher than it should be, if you engage in protectionist trade policies that put tariffs on countries, and if you go to war with a country that supplies oil, you're probably going to see some inflationary effects. The question is how much? And I do think that's affecting people's thinking about the presidency. Immigration is important in pockets. It's an important issue. But I think the dominant issue is the economy and inflation in particular. And I think that's what most candidates probably should be running on. There are a lot of, sort of specific issues that people want to run on. But generally speaking, those are the things that are on the minds of voters these days based upon what we know about public opinion polling. So that's kind of all I wanted to talk about, Al, because I thought there might be some questions. But I highly recommend that you, if you want to learn a little bit more about these districts, that you take some time and go to VPAP. I guess one more thing I would say, going to this map, I was reading with the Crystal Ball, which is a website that is an offshoot of Larry Sabato's Center for Politics, and I think Larry's people are some of the best prognosticators in the country, and it's a treasure trove of data. What they say is, if you look at this map, this redistricted map where the Democrats have an advantage, 10-to-1 advantage, they think the most competitive district is this one right here, which is the 6th district. And the reason for that is, you can see that that Spanberger won the seat by almost over 9 points. The reason for that is it tends to take in a lot of college towns, and they're liberal leaning, but the students aren't necessarily, the young people aren't near as reliable of voters as older people. So they think if there's a weakness somewhere in the Democrats' plan, it might be the 6th district, and that makes sense to me. But I do think in a year where the Republican incumbent president is not particularly popular, there's a really good chance that the Democrats could win 10 out of these 11 seats as it was drawn up. So anyway, that's kind of what I had, Al. I mean, I'm happy to take some questions if there are any. Thank you. No applause, just throw money. Money's all I need to run for Congress. Just kidding. Ah, there it is.
Is it on? Yeah, okay. I think it's probably fair to say that across the spectrum of the U.S., pretty much the majority of voters don't like gerrymandering in whatever form it is. Is there, and I know that legislation at one point it was introduced in Congress to stop it, basically, and go to a system like what Virginia had. But obviously, there are political pressures to do nothing.
Yeah.
Could you comment on the ability of Congress to fix this?
Sure.
And how that might happen?
Yeah, happy. Good question. In case you didn't hear, the question was, what can Congress do to fix this situation? It is an issue that is really, like many issues, is begging for Congress to do something. Now, under our Constitution, the states have a lot of leverage in terms of election law. And I think something like 34, 35 states, and among that, the state legislatures really kind of have a great deal of control over redistricting. But about 34 of the 50 states have what amounts to what Virginia used to have, which is a kind of legislative process for redrawing maps. And for many, many years, what you had was what was called incumbent gerrymandering, right? That is to say, the state legislature would draw lines every 10 years that protected the incumbent, okay? Well, obviously, Congress wasn't going to do anything about that, okay? And again, that's 35 states. That's quite a few. What do the other states have? Well, they have something like what Virginia used to have, currently has, which is a commission of some kind. And then there are certain states, five or six states, I can't remember, that actually have one congressman. So they don't do any redistricting. I think there's 5. So, state legislatures have, under the Constitution, been given a lot of leeway and a lot of leverage in terms of how they draw their maps. Now, again, with the district partisanship, essentially they are just unabashedly drawing lines that are partisan. And the court has been okay with that, going back to Veith versus Jubilee back in 2004, 2005. Racial gerrymandering has also been a critical part of district redistricting over the many years, and the court has now basically said, after a series of cases, and now finally this last case in Louisiana, essentially saying racial gerrymandering is no longer essentially legal. And so you now have an open field, but with a heavy, intense amount of time, pressure being put on partisanship, because we are living in an age of intense partisanship and very narrow margins, right? That it doesn't take much, right? I think the Republicans have a 3-seat advantage in the House of Representatives right now. I mean, just blocking and tackling, all you got to do is win 5 or 6 seats and you get the majority. And so this kind of tendency to pursue power is what's driving these kind of partisan redistricting efforts. Congress can, however, under the Constitution, legislate in this way. And it could, for example, outlaw on its own racial gerrymandering. It'd be harder to do the partisan gerrymandering, right? Because right now, states that partisan gerrymander basically they just pretty much come out and say, we're doing it. Yesterday, I think in Tennessee, the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader of the Tennessee Senate said, yeah, well, we're a Republican state and we're just going to have all Republican districts. I mean, just literally just came right out and said, before people be cagey about it a little bit. I think the court at least has had a hard time figuring out what constitutes a partisan gerrymander. And that's why it's hard to legislate too. But that'd be one area where Congress could step in, is to legislate. Guarantee everybody, the right to vote, et cetera, but maybe put some kind of limit on or outlaw racial gerrymandering. My concern is what's going to happen is if the court changes hands, it's just going to reverse itself. I mean, because it's just hard to hold on to precedents in this kind of context. So I think Congress could do something and maybe should do something. But let me tell you what I don't agree with. And then maybe somebody else has a question. I don't agree with the federal government telling the states how to run their elections. I just don't buy it. And I think it's not a good idea. And so I hope, but to go back to your other point, there are polls that show that Americans really don't like the gerrymandering. They particularly don't like partisan gerrymandering. And yet it continues to happen. So that's a long answer to your question. I hope it gets to it some way. Yeah. Sure. I'll try to be a little more concise, Al.
So what is the constitutional authority for the federal government to enter into anything that modulates the state's right to control their election process?
I don't have the Constitution memorized or in my pocket right now, but I think it's Article 1, Section 2 or Section 3, which says that Congress from time to time can pass legislation on elections, and it has done so. The Voting Rights Act is a good example. Okay, that's Congress intervening in our elections. The National Voter Registration Act, right? The so-called Motor Voter Law, that's Congress intervening in elections. The Help America Vote Act after the 2000 election, that's Congress. Okay, so Congress can. It said the Constitution says Congress from time to time can pass legislation dealing with elections, national elections. The problem is so many our elections are administered at the state level. So they're tied together with state politics so much that typically that Congress has deferred to the states to kind of handle it. Yeah, because the Constitution says the state shall decide the time, place, and manner of elections, but Congress from time to time it can change the law. Dan, you might know more about this than me.
We as voters are waiting for the state Supreme Court to make its decision. Would you please clarify your guess?
I don't have a guess. I've read a couple of things. I haven't watched the court. Several people have, and I picked up some bits and pieces there, but I'm not really sure what the court's going to do. Sorry.
Okay. Would you tell us how important money is in this congressional election?
Well, money's important in every election, but the typical kind of general finding that congressional scholars have taken away is that, it matters most in a competitive race, and the difference matters less than a certain threshold. So if a candidate has enough money to run a good race, it doesn't matter if the other candidate has more money, okay? If you were going to map the fundraising with the actual vote share, basically you look at a graph that would look something like this. The first amount of dollars would matter a lot, and then the more and more you spend, it would even out, and it would just kind of go on into affinity like that. So the first amount of money, the amount of money you spend in terms of the early going matters greatly, but after a while, more and more money doesn't make that much difference, if that makes any sense. So to go to this district here, let's say that Whitman has, well, we can find out exactly how much money he has, but let's not go into that. Let's say he has $5 million, okay? If Taylor has 3.5 million, she can beat him. She has enough money to run a competitive race. Now, if he has 10 million and she has 100,000, game over. You follow me? So it all depends on the competitiveness of the race, and also most competitive races are funded pretty well. Because money comes in, and it comes in from the outside of the state, comes outside of the district, and it just kind of comes. In fact, I remember a delegate telling me a couple of years ago about this. They won their nomination for the House of Delegates, and I said, "Well, what was fundraising like?" He said, "Well, actually, once you get the nomination and you're in like a competitive race, people just send you money. You don't even have to have a fundraiser; they just send it to you." Because again, narrow margins attract money in these competitive races. So money always matters, but it sort of matters more in competitive races, and it matters more that you have enough money to run a really good campaign.
Other questions?
You mentioned earlier compactness and connectedness. Talk a little bit about what you mean or define connectedness.
Yeah. There is one other condition too, and that's what's called communities of interest, which is somewhat nebulous. But connectedness means that all parts of the district should be connected in some way, right? In Virginia, that's hard because you do have the shore, the eastern shore. And so you do have that kind of challenge there of literally a disconnect. But what it means is all parts should be connected. You should be able to go anywhere in the district, right? Walk anywhere, drive anywhere, and they should be connected with each other in some way, right? You shouldn't have let's take this right here. Let's say that Roanoke were just like an island unto itself and was popped into the 9th district, even though you had blue to the south and blue to the west. That would be an example of being non-contiguous. All these are contiguous, interestingly enough, I think. That is to say, they're all kind of in some ways connected. Maybe something going on over here in Norfolk. No, that's about right. So that's what it means. The problem is the community of interest. Like, what is that? For some states, what it means is you want to have all of the existing kind of counties and cities together. If you look at Iowa, for example, Iowa has a nonpartisan redistricting commission, and they try strenuously not to split counties apart. And so if you look at a map of Iowa, you'll see that the districts are highly, they're very contiguous, and they're kind of as compact as possible, but they try to hold together. That's hard to do. I mean, it's Iowa, so it's hard to do in a place like Virginia, for example, to say, okay, the district's going to have there's going to be one district for, Henrico County and one district only. Or it's going to be one district for Richmond City. So it tends sometimes not to, be able to align it perfectly with the district, with the local government boundaries.
When I was involved in politics in the late 60s, the 3rd Congressional District was Richmond, Henrico, and Chesterfield.
Mm-hmm.
What we were just talking about.
Right.
And that's what you dealt with. Now the district runs from Richmond down to North Carolina and all over everywhere.
So what part of the 1960s. Was that early or?
The late 60s.
Yeah, the reason why I mention that is because Westbury versus Sanders was a court case which essentially dictated that congressional districts had to be roughly equal in terms of population. One of the biggest problems, particularly in southern states until that case, was that some districts would be really large and some districts would be really small, like literally 100,000 people versus 500,000 people. Well, that's not exactly one person, one vote standard, right? So during that period, we were undergoing change. I wonder if that third district was bigger in some ways than some of the South Side districts in terms of population, that they were trying to keep those together. That's one of the trade-offs you have, right, with these communities of interest. So I don't know. I'd have to go back and look at it. Do you recall what the size of it was in terms of population? Because that's the standard now. Districts have to be somewhere within, I don't even know what it is, 1.5%, 2% variance. You know, no district can be too big. You know, should be disproportionate in terms of size.
Is this on? I just got a notification the Virginia Supreme Court overruled the redistricting.
Okay. I should have predicted that. Darn. Well, there's one, regardless of your particular position on this, there is one advantage to that, and that is to say that what really would have been bad is if it kept waiting to make a decision, right? Because you got it right now. The primaries have been pushed off to August as it is, anticipating the idea that there would be a change. So it does create some stability. And, you know, I'm in favor of the 10 years, and I'm in favor of the bipartisan commission, generally speaking. But I understand why the Democrats tried to do this. I'd like to see the rationale for the opinion, you know, before we jump to any conclusions. Thanks for that news feed, though. That's big. Imagine that. The men's breakfast at Cedarfield. Anything can happen.
Are there other questions?
There's one over here, I think. No?
No. Dan, I have one. How volatile or changeable is Trump's approval rating? And if it were to get much better, when would it be too late for Republicans? I mean, if it gets better at Halloween, is that going to be too late, or how does that work?
The October surprise. Is that what it is, Al? You waiting for the October surprise? Yeah. I mean, obviously, historically, the approval ratings typically don't change that much between, say, now and Election Day. I'm wondering what kind of, first of all, let's talk a little bit about the bottom, okay? He has approval rating right now that hovers around 40%. Now, obviously, I know there's a lot of distrust in polls, and I get all that. But the reality is, if you keep taking samples, random samples, and keep asking the same question, you got something's real, okay? As long as you can approximate the population. So a 40% approval rating is not good. And the chances of it going up aren't that good either. Now, obviously, peace in the Middle East would help. A stabilization of prices would help. But in some ways, some of that stuff is already baked in. So I can't really answer the question with any degree of precision, except to say that traditionally, the president loses seats, and it would take a lot to move this around. Now, some people say, well, 40%. I think given our polarized country, that's about as low as a president can actually go. Because of people's commitment already to a particular party, you're starting out the day at 40%. Okay, it's hard. Trump had about a 51, 52% approval rating in the early going. Even that's hard to do when you consider the fact that, you know, nearly 49% of the voters voted against him. You know, so I mean, people are locked into their partisanship, and so 40 is not a good sign. For it to go down that low means he's at the bottom. You're not going to get much lower than that. And so there's really only one way to go, and that's up for him. But that's going to depend a lot on the conditions on the ground, I think.
I think we're done, Dan.
Thank you all. Thank you.